Hi, I'm Rowan Miller. Let's write an application that uses Entity Framework Model First to access data in a relational database. In this workflow, we design a model using boxes and lines in the Entity Framework Designer, and then generate a database based on that model. I'm going to use Visual Studio 2012, but you can also use Visual Studio 2010. I'm going to start by creating a new console application, and I'm going to call this one Model First Sample. Now that we have an application, let's go ahead and add a model using the Entity Framework Designer. I start by right-clicking on the project and selecting Add New Item. In here I select Data from the left menu and then ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'm going to call this one Blogging Model. In this workflow we want to start with an empty model, so I'm going to select that and then click Finish. Before we start designing the model, I'm going to right-click on the design surface and select Properties. This brings up the properties for the model. I'm going to change the entity container name to blogging context. We'll see a little bit later where this name gets used. With that done, I'm going to right-click and select Add New Entity, and I'm going to create an entity that's called blog and has a primary key called blog ID. I'm then going to go ahead and add a couple of scalar properties to this entity. I do this by right-clicking on the entity and selecting Add New Scalar Property. The first thing I'm going to add is a name property. Once I've added the name, I'm also going to go ahead and add a URL property. Once the URL property is there, I'm going to right-click on it and select Properties. This brings up the properties for this scalar property, and I'm going to change the nullable from false to true. This means that we can save a blog without having a URL assigned to it. In this Properties window, I can also do things such as changing the data type. By default, properties are string, and that's fine for the properties that I've added so far. I'm now going to add a post entity to our model using the techniques we've already seen. I'm going to give this two scalar properties, one called title and one called content. For these properties, the defaults are fine. Now that we've added two entities, let's add a relationship between them. I'm going to right-click on the design surface and select Add Association. Inside Entity Framework, the term association and relationship are used interchangeably. In the Add Association dialog, I can configure this relationship. It just so happens in this case that the defaults are appropriate. Once I select OK, the relationship is added to the Entity Designer. Now that we've defined the shape of our model, it's time to generate the database. We do this by right-clicking on the design surface and selecting Generate Database from Model. I now specify the connection to the database that I want to create. I'm using Visual Studio 2012, which comes with LocalDB, so I'm going to create a model-first.blogging database on LocalDB. The wizard now calculates the appropriate SQL script to run to create the database. Once that's displayed, I can click Finish and the SQL script is added to my project. If I look at the script, I can see there's create statements in here for the blog and post table. I'm going to go ahead and execute this script now. And then if I go and look at my LocalDB instance, I can see that these tables have been added to the model-first.blogging database. Now I'm going to go back to my model in the Entity Framework Designer and save it so that I can start using it to perform data access. Before we start writing code, let's look at the classes we're going to interact with. If I expand the EDMX file in Solution Explorer, I'll see a couple of TT files nested under there. These are responsible for generating the code that I'm going to interact with in my application. Note, if you're using Visual Studio 2010, these TT files won't be included in your project. Instead, you'll have code generated that uses Entity Framework 4. To upgrade to the latest version of Entity Framework, you'll need to follow some extra steps that are covered in the walkthrough that accompanies this video. I can see one of the things it's generating is a blogging context. This class is a derived context that inherits from DB context, which is a type in the Entity Framework. This derived context is going to represent the session with the database and allows us to query and save data. Within the derived context, there are a set of DB set properties, and these allow us to query and save instances of the types in our model. Entity Framework is also generating a class for each type in our model. Looking at the blog one, I can see that this is a simple model that is made up of two types of properties: scalar properties, such as blog ID and name, and then navigation properties that represent the relationships in our model, such as the posts property shown here. Let's go over to the main method in our program and write some code to use this model to perform data access. I'm going to start by creating a new instance of the blogging context. Note that when we create an instance of a context, we always wrap it in a using statement to ensure that any resources are freed up when we're finished with it. Next, I'm going to prompt the user for a name for a new blog. Once we have the name, I'm going to create a new instance of our blog class and assign this name. I can then add this instance to the blogs property on our context. Remember that the blogs property is a DB set of blog. With this done, I can go ahead and call save changes on the context. This will write any pending changes out to the database. In this case, that's a single insert for the new blog. Let's also write a link query to retrieve all blogs from the database ordered by name. We can then for each over the results of this query and write the name of each blog out to the console. Now that I've written an application, let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. As expected, we're prompted for the name of a new blog. I'm going to use ado.net blog. All blogs in the database are then written out to the console. At the moment, that's a single blog instance that we just inserted. Now that we've created a model, let's go ahead and apply some changes to that model and see how we push these changes to the database. I'm going to open up my model again in the Entity Framework Designer, and I'm going to add a new entity. This one's going to be a user, and it's going to have a primary key called username, this time of type string. I'm going to open up the properties for username and change the max length to 50. This means that a username can be up to 50 characters long. I'm also going to add a display name property to this user entity. Now that I've changed my model, I'm going to right-click on the design surface again and select Generate Database from Model. Entity Framework is going to recreate the script to create my database. When I click Finish, I'm going to get a couple of warnings. The first warning is just letting me know that Entity Framework is about to overwrite the contents of the SQL script file that it previously added to my project. Because Entity Framework is recalculating the shape of the database, this second warning lets me know that it's going to overwrite the storage and mapping sections in my model. The storage section records the shape of the database, and the mapping section records how the entities map to that database. It's important to note, if I look at the script in my project, that it's not migrating the database, but rather dropping all the tables and then recreating them again from scratch. This is important because it will incur data loss. Currently, there isn't a good solution to do migration of the database when you're using the Entity Framework Designer. This is something our team is planning to address in the future, but for the moment, if you don't want to incur data loss, you would need to either hand edit the schema or use some other tooling to calculate a change script. I'm going to go ahead and run the script. When I do this, I can see that the schema has been recreated, this time to include the users table. In this video, we looked at how to create a model using the Entity Framework Designer, and then how to generate a database from that model. We then used that model to perform data access. We also applied some changes to that model and saw how to recreate the database to match the changed model.